So hosting the spotlight today is myself and Colette. We are both in the assessment solution in LHH, and I've been LHH since 2021. I'm a chartered occupational psychologist. I've been in leadership assessment for a long time, and in all the different areas of leadership, I find hyper assessment probably one of the most exciting and intriguing pieces in leadership assessment, because when done right, you're helping individuals to actually reach the potential, but also at the same time helping the organisation to achieve that greater success. And this is exactly what we'll be looking at in today's webinar. Joining me today is Colette, and I'll hand it over to her for some introduction.
Lovely, thanks Jenny. So good morning, afternoon, wherever you're located. Lovely to have you with us. Thank you for joining. If you did join Spotlight 1, you might be familiar with myself. I presented that with my colleague Narita. So I'm really delighted to be back here today for Spotlight 2. For those of you that didn't join, that's no problem. Just to briefly introduce myself, as Jenny said, I sit in the assessment solution team in LHH Leadership Development, and I've been at LHH for 2014, and I've been in talent and development for about 17, 18 years. And like Jenny, all things assessment intrigue me, but particularly high potential assessment and looking at future leaders is something that we're both very passionate about. So really looking forward to sharing what we do in this space, giving you some ideas, and hopefully prompting you with some questions to think about in your own organisations.
Thank you for that. So before we get started, I just want to say that, there may be different reasons why you're here today. Maybe you want to know a bit more about hypo assessment. Maybe you just want to kind of think about updating your hypo strategy, or you just want to know some of the best practices relating to hypo. Now, this webinar is designed for you to take whatever you find useful for you or your organisation, depending on the activities that your organisation is currently doing, for hypoactification as well as development. There may be things that you already know, but hopefully there will be some nuggets that you'll find useful. At the end of the session, there will be a prompt questions for you to think about, what your organisation is doing and can do as well, and that will be for you to take away. So today is the second of the 3 spotlights we're running. Each spotlight is actually aimed at making assessment accessible to everyone. So not just the technical experts in the assessment field, but our aim is to also help in each of this webinar series to help you understand our point of view. So hopefully that will provoke challenges in your thinking, as well as invite you in your role to explore and consider these topics. We hope these 3 spotlights will leave you with a clear sense of how LHH views these areas and provide you with a frame in which to consider these areas moving forward. So let's look at today's agenda. So we will be looking at, firstly, the what and the why. So what do we mean by hypos, and why should we bother looking at this particular population of talent? We then move on to how exactly do we assess them, or can we assess them? Of course, simply assessing them is not quite enough. You want to make sure that you engage them, you're retaining them, and last but not least, what about those who are not hypos but actually performs really well in the organisation? And we'll do the Q&A, as we said before, right at the end. So let's dive into the first point on gender. Over to you, Colette.
Jenny, lovely. All right, great. So we're going to start by considering what do we mean by high potentials, and how do we indeed define that? So perhaps as you're sitting there, you might be thinking about your own definitions in your own organisations. We'll encourage you to think about whether your organisation's definition is still current. Is it inclusive enough? And maybe you're sitting here with the opportunity to perhaps define this for the first time. Got a couple of, or a few definitions, should I say, here at the moment for your consideration. And the definition, of course, becomes really critical because it will determine who you identify in the organisation. As I mentioned, how inclusive that lens is that you place in your organisation for talent identification processes. And of course, it will then define who goes on to be developed, having been determined as having potential. So there are lots and lots of definitions out there. We've just selected 3 for you to consider. And as you'll notice, the first 2 really converge on similar themes around ability, engagement, and inspiration. Jenny, later in the spotlight, is going to talk about those same three things in relation to the way in which assessments might take place. And of course, as you look at this definition, you may already have a view on how far you agree with these. Maybe your definitions are quite similar in your own organisation, or maybe actually you're looking at these thinking that there are some points of divergence for yourself. It may also start to surface questions that you've already maybe pondered, which is, to what extent does high potential and high performance relate to each other, and is high performance necessary as a prerequisite for high potential? And can you have high potential without that high performance? So again, give some consideration to where your own definition sits. At LHH, we have our own model of potential, and we refer to this as the 3D model of potential. Jenny mentioned at the start of this webinar that we have a key symbol on those slides that will be shared at the end. So this, you'll be grateful to know, is one of the slides that we're going to be giving away at the end. And our model of potential is really based on both a systematic, I can put my teeth in, systematic review of the literature and research that exists around high potentials, as well as, of course, our own experience around what it means to be a potential. And our model looks at drive, which is really about how much ambition and engagement or determination somebody has. And when we look at that, we're really looking at things like motivation to succeed, career drive, conscientiousness, enthusiasm, and alignment with organisational value. The second thing that our model looks at is depth. And so this is about core personal characteristics which underpin successful growth in an individual. So again, here we'll be considering things like emotional intelligence, somebody's presence, interpersonal skills, navigating politics, also hardiness. So you can see we've got resilience there. So being able to navigate ambiguity, courage to take risks, all of these things sitting within that, that frame of depth. And then the final one is dexterity. So this is really about thinking ability and learning agility. And under here, we're thinking about the extent to which somebody learns continuously, adapts, has analytical rigor in their thinking, is able to push boundaries, perhaps in the way that they innovate and think strategically. And all of this then sits as competencies under those terms, which allows us then to assess and rate an individual in terms of their high potential alignment with this model. Jenny's going to talk more about this model in terms of assessment and approaches that we might offer up for your consideration. And we're going to give a view on what individuals who are identified as having high potential might also be bringing in terms of their own perspective. And that's something that we think is really important. But whilst we're on this slide at the moment, the one thing we did want to really, I guess, pay attention to and call it out is drive. So we know that drive from an individual perspective is a really critical characteristic in a high potential, because you may, of course, have somebody with the capability and the intellect to be a high potential, but they may not actually have the desire to progress to more senior levels. And that, of course, can change over time. So that isn't something that may be enduring for somebody. So it's really important, and we recommend that you give consideration to where somebody sits on that drive aspect at any one time. So life factors, cultural fit with an organisation, values with the organisation, which I can see in the chat, may all be influencing the extent to which somebody has a desire to develop to more senior levels in that particular organisation. So we're going to move on to invite you to share in the chat why identifying high potential talent is important for your organisation. I hope that perhaps it is because you've joined this spotlight, but is it important to you right now? Is it a priority for your organisation? And if so, why is that? Indeed, we're going to summarise much of what you have already shared in the chat and just kind of frame that for you. So the first thing, and it may seem obvious for those of you really familiar in this topic area, but of course it's worth being reminded that just because somebody is a high performer doesn't necessarily mean that they will have high potential to move into more senior future leadership roles. And often that distinction we know is something that managers who may be involved in nominating or identifying high potentials can struggle with that differentiation. So really enabling managers to be really clear about what's the distinction and how do they apply a definition can be very helpful to really uncovering high potential talent in your organisation. And of course, we know that identifying those as high potential is important for targeting differential investment and obviously getting a return on that accelerated development that might be offered if a programme does follow that identification. Of course, again, we haven't talked about it in the chat, but we may recognise that those individuals who may not be performing may still have potential. And again, that may factor in the way that you approach identification and giving consideration to what might be some of the barriers for performance right now that we don't want to then lose the opportunity to identify a high potential. So in short, there are 3 advantages which you've all called out for yourselves. So the first, of course, is that high potential talent brings competitive advantage to an organisation. So we know from lots of research and our own experience that high potentials do in fact bring more value to an organisation. Some would say as much as up to 90% more. That's an incredible statistic. And exert more effort. And again, if we were to put a number on it, some research would say up to 20% more effort from a high potential employee than non-high potential related peers. We also know that having a high potential within a team actually has a knock-on positive influence. So teams benefit from having high potential employees within that and boost performance of their colleagues and counterparts around them. And then, of course, we know that high potentials, of course, do more readily adapt and move with changes in the organisation. Secondly, retention, another common theme within the chat. So by identifying and developing high potential talent, they are, of course, more likely to stay. We know that high potentials who aren't paid attention to are more likely to leave. And of course, in today's climate, with the big great resignation and talent shortages, being able to retain talent, of course, is a priority for many organisations, and we've seen that amongst yourselves. Third and finally, we haven't overlooked succession. Of course, having a process to identify high potential talent will allow you to know your bench strength available and prepare them for future leadership roles. And again, we'll come on to talk about some of the factors, but things like ageing population in the workforce, an important consideration and factor to pay attention to. So Jenny's going to move us on now to talk about the ways in which we can assess high potential talent.
Thank you, Colette. I noticed someone asked for slides for this session. Just to remind you, we will share it at the end of the session. We won't share the whole deck. We'll only share the slides for the key symbol on top. Okay, thank you. So now we know why high potential. Exactly how do we assess them? So before I tell you the different ways to identify hypos, let's run a quick poll to understand what are people in this current webinar doing in terms of hypo assessment. So as you will see on the screen, the first option is we do not identify hypos. Second option is our managers decide who are hypo and or utilize an iBox grid. Third one is we have a comprehensive process with objective assessment to assess hypos. Now, whilst we're waiting for the results, let me just quickly tell you that organizations do vary quite a lot in approach to assess hypos. Some use manager ratings, which can be a performance rating, or it can be rating with specific criteria that's perhaps then entered into that iBox grid. While this is quite a common practice, the ratings are quite subjective and can be, subject to conscious and unconscious bias. Therefore, by itself is not the most robust way to measure hypos. If you can have a diverse panel to review the ratings, then great, it can improve that objectivity. But of course, how psychological say people feel within that rating meeting can influence how honest people are or how willing they are to challenge that ratings. So Rebecca, can you share the poll results, please? So I can see most people are in that middle. Our managers decide who the hypos are or utilize iBox grid. Some have very high comprehensive process. Others do not identify. Actually, one thing I did forget to mention, if you feel comfortable sharing, please do share the process you have if you chose 3. So I'm just checking quickly if there's anything on the chat. So some organizations do use assessment to measure the hypos. Now, in the next slide, you will see the different methods available. Now, some organizations may use a combination of different approaches, so they might use manager ratings and assessments together. Let's have a look at the different ways you can assess people. If my slides move, perfect. Now, there are many different types of assessment when it comes to hyper assessment, as you can see on the screen. You can use 360 to measure the reputation an individual has. You can use cognitive assessment to understand their intellectual horsepower, or you can assess their personality to see if they have the right competencies for either the roles or hyper competencies. Now, looking at their potential through learning agility is another way. Learning agility, as Colette mentioned previously, it is the ability and willingness to learn quickly and then apply these lessons to perform well in new and challenging situations. Research have actually found that individuals with high levels of learning agility tend to be more successful in managerial positions or exec positions than those who possess lower levels. Lastly, you have job fit, which looks at how well individuals can perform at that high level function. Just go to quickly in the chat because someone has shared some of their processes, assessments based on competencies, more functional and job capability rather than personal elements, leadership mindset, behavior, etc., which is what we're missing. Thank you, Emily. So do keep the comments on, we'll address it later on as well. So how do you decide which assessment option to go for? Because there's so many. Now, the different ways, the different elements that you should be considering, firstly is budget. Obviously, how much do you have to available spend on this hypos could determine what assessment. Bear in mind, you probably need to invest in their development as well. Now, the second option to think about, or the second thing to think about in deciding which assessment to use is the purpose of assessment. So is it for succession planning? Is it for development? Or is it just for identification? Now, typically, we won't recommend just to identify them because identification without development in general is not a great idea because you're not really tapping into their potential and you're not keeping them engaged. Now, thirdly, level or seniority could also affect which assessment you use. So sometimes a client comes to us wanting to assess their junior leaders or individual contributors, while others come to us to assess their potential for their senior leaders. Now, the more senior the hypos are, the more comprehensive you want the assessment to be, because the roles that they're likely to fill are senior roles, therefore you don't want to get it wrong at that level. Lastly, the definition of hypos could determine how you assess hypos. And I'm going to show you an example of how that's done right now. Let's get to the next slide. So let's take CV's example, definition, for example. So a hypo is someone with aspiration, ability, and engagement. And therefore, your criteria, or as well as what you'd be measuring, should exactly be these 3 elements. So let's go through each criterion one by one. So aspiration is about, the aspiration of someone to rise up to more senior position. This is your motivation and drive to achieve higher and aim higher. Ability is about your ability to be effective in more senior positions. Now, according to research, these abilities, or the abilities that are predictive of future leadership success includes cognitive ability and emotional intelligence. So particularly the ability to manage yourself as well as managing others. Aside from these 2 abilities, you might also want to look at the abilities or competencies that's required for the roles that the hypos are likely to fill. These competencies should be aligned with the future business strategy so that you actually future-proofing the organization. And lastly, engagement. So this is about how committed an individual is to their organization. Once you're clear about what you need to measure, you then need to think about how to collect this information and who to collect this information from. The more data you can gather, the more robust the decision will be. So let's look at some of the example of who and how you can collect it from. So what you'll see is you can get the data from the manager, from the participant themselves, or from other sources. So let's take manager first. So to understand whether someone has aspiration, you can ask the manager for, the point of view by asking, is this someone you'll nominate for the hyper program? Now, hopefully, this manager has had that career conversation with the hypo to understand their aspiration. To understand their ability, besides performance rating, you can ask the manager to use 360 to provide a more structured assessment of their direct report's ability. And lastly, engagement. You can obtain this information through calibration discussions between the managers or through a career conversation that they've had with their direct reports. Now, you can also collect information from the hypos themselves. So for aspiration, you can ask them to share with you. You can assess them using psychometrics. For ability, you can use 360 again to understand, where the hypos think they are in terms of these competencies. You can utilize works on the test to really understand, do they actually possess the right competencies? For engagement, it could be through a panel interview, or it can just through a conversation with the hypos. There are, of course, other sources as well. So these can be a commitment contract. So this is where the contract outlines the mutual expectations. So if you join the hypo program, for example, you must turn up to all the workshops. Or if you stay, if you join the program, you have to stay in the company for a year. Otherwise, you might have to pay back the investment. The idea really is that, collect as much info as you can and then combine all this data to create that holistic view of whether this person can be considered a hypo or not. So, as previously mentioned, that at LHH, we do have, we define hypo as someone who has the drive, the depth, and dexterity. And so we measure these competencies relating to each of these categories using psychometrics. Now, this is typically what we use for a more junior level hypos because it's relatively inexpensive, can be scaled, but also the report you get gives you an overall rating for each of the skills, but probably most importantly, the development recommendations. These recommendations are important so that hypo can actually start working on the areas and take it further to develop themselves. We do recommend to share these development actions with the line managers so that they can actually help the hypos to prioritize where to develop as well as to support them appropriately. Later on, I know there's been a few questions on the chat and we will come back to them. So when I see questions, I really want to answer them, but I need to stop myself doing that and come back to that. So one reason companies identify that as senior hypos is trying to understand the bench strength and making sure that there is someone to step into that critical position in case, existing senior leaders leave or retire. For senior hypos, you want to be a lot more thorough, as we mentioned before, in assessment because the cost of getting it wrong, so placing a wrong person into the role, is a lot higher at this level. But also at this level, you want to look at additional skill sets such as strategic thinking as well as vision. Now, for senior hypos where the results could feed into succession planning, we may use our acumen assessment to do a deep dive. So if you attended the Spotlight one, you will know or be familiar with acumen as our senior leader assessment approach with a human-centered lens. If you haven't been, I will send you a recording later. Now, here we utilize our model known to predict leadership success and align it with the organization's competencies and future directions to make sure that we're getting as many data points as possible and future-proofing, what we're assessing. So in essence, the purpose of the hypo identification is important, but so is the level and the role that, you're assessing. I know I've talked a lot in the last few minutes and cram it in. So quick summary, based on what we discussed so far, it's important to remember, assuming high performance are high potentials could be a common error. Another common error is misclassification of individuals through hypos through only subjective nomination or feedback from managers. Another common pitfalls could be, failing to identify the core leadership requirements needed to drive that business performance and outcome. It could also be focusing too much on the current measurement and not enough on the future role requirement. And lastly, investing too much money or time on individuals who are not quite committed to the organization. So these are the common errors or common pitfalls that we see.
And Jenny, just before you move on to the slide, I think there was a comment just from Emily, the slide before the one prior, I think something has cut off. So it said focus, and I think, Emily, you were just keen to see what was missing, I think. Let's go back. No, it's the one prior to that, I think.
This one, focus. Oh, so in Acumen, we assess 3 areas for leaders. We assess their capability, which there are 12 of them. We assess their motivation, and we assess their focus. So essentially, when they make business decisions, where do they tend to place their focus? Do they tend to focus more on area, sales, for example, or marketing? Or so basically, in order to be a very senior leader, you will hopefully hope that their focus is quite equal on things, or on certain elements where we see from research or in the past, or through validation as being important. So this is what the focus is about. Hopefully this is what you're referring to.
It's just at the end it says decision making and I think it's stakeholder or critical stakeholder management is what's missing on that definition, Emily.
Got you.
And then just two questions maybe just before we move on. One question was, any suggestions to reduce bias in the identification approach?
Perfect. I am going to come back to that point.
Perfect.
Thank you for setting up nicely, but it will
and
come.
Then the next one, just final, any recommendations for assessing individual contributors who aren't currently sitting in leadership roles but showing high potential?
Sorry, can you repeat that? Okay, it's just an assessment individual contributors showing hyper, but they're not. So we do have, I guess a lot of companies, this is what I meant, sometimes they come to us and say, look, we've got a group of individual contributors, they're not quite leaders, but we want to know whether they have that capability to go inside that leadership position. And this is where the hyper assessment comes in. So you can utilize assessment to understand, for example, do they have the right competencies, or do they have the learning agility, which will indicate that they're willing to learn and apply it in the future. So these can be used for that individual contributor target.
So that 3D model, Emma, that we had up just prior to the Acumen slide, maybe we can just go back to that, Jenny. That we have an approach which aligns to this, and we recognise this as being an opportunity to uncover high potential talent deeper within the organisation, as you say, perhaps at levels where they are still individual contributors, and it's done through psychometrics and produces a single report with ratings against drive, depth and dexterity and the competencies. And for us, that can be quite a pragmatic, scalable, and often quite revealing process for identifying high potential talents. Another way is for self-nomination, so having individual contributors to have discussions with their managers and to converge on position themselves based on self-rating and alignment to perhaps a model similar to this. Hope that helps.
Perfect. And actually, Claire, you've led quite nicely into exactly what I wanted to ask him, which is, what are some of your biggest challenges when identifying hypos? And once we understand the challenges, hopefully we can address some of the common challenges that we see as well. So certainly that challenge of how do you objectively identify hypos is one that we do get asked a lot by the clients. We see a lot from what our clients are facing. So definitely something that we see. So if you wouldn't mind, just spend a minute or two to type in the chat, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face when identifying high potentials?
Yeah, lovely. So in the chat, Sarah has popped understanding potential for what. So exactly that, when you're identifying what are we saying they have potential for. Yeah,
absolutely.
Being identified too early, not having clear enough definition, subjectivity, differentiating performance and potential, bias. Amy, that was raised earlier in the chat.
I think Sarah's point about identifying the potential for what is important, and this is why the definition is so important, because your definition will help you understand actually why do you want to identify hypo, and therefore that's when you can understand, okay, potential for, is it potential to just go up levels in leadership position, or is it potential to do much bigger scope of work. So that's why defining what hypos mean to start off with is really important.
Carl, you've raised a lovely point. It's slightly separate to this challenge here, but I guess it is related. So lovely question about potential narcissistic tendencies of senior leaders and how that's taken into account with any approach that we consider. So we'll reference back to acumen, which was discussed in more detail in Spotlight 1 with myself and Narita. I'm really happy to share the recording, but in essence, as we said, it's a really human-centered, deep dive psychological assessment, which allows the whole person to be considered through a suite of psychometric tools, but also, as I say, a deep dive psychological interview or semi-structured conversation with an occupational psychologist. And it's through that assimilation of the different psychometrics that tendencies such as narcissism would be identified and spotted, and the implications of those would be recognised and discussed with the senior leader themselves around the risks and potential pitfalls, but also if it was in the case of an identification process, a promotion process or a selection process, that the implication of that would be possible to call out for the sponsoring organisation, for example. But I agree with you, there are some real risks at the senior level of identifying individuals who perhaps have tendencies that are unlikely to encourage followership and true psychological safety, for example.
Absolutely. And there are lots of loving comments about, wanting to have that objective measure, but also communication. So, what do you communicate? Setting expectations as well, which we'll also talk about. So yeah, lovely, lots and lots different reasons, different challenges that you face. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pivot into next.
Just one more point in the chat, some great comments in the chat. So thank you for engaging with us in this way. I know it's always difficult when you're on mute. But so what of the process? So once you've identified them, so what? We are going to talk a little bit about retention strategies, although I fear we may not go as deep enough as we would perhaps love to, but we will give you some ideas around that. The other one that was called out was being careful to consider neurodiversity in the population. So not just those who are going to be good at portraying potential through their communication and presentation, but actually being really inclusive. And I think that's a lovely call out too. Our third and final spotlight is about the future of assessments, and we will touch on, albeit it won't be the main focus, but there will be an element to which we give consideration to points that, like you've made, Sue, around how do we ensure assessments in the future are more inclusive and take account of things like neurodiversity.
Absolutely. When it comes to assessing neurodiversity individuals, currently the best practice is that if you have candidates who might sit in that population, to let us know as early as possible so we can make the right adjustment for those individuals. Because without knowing it, you might set up the assessment that's ready for a non or typical neurodiverse person, whereas as soon as we know, we can make the right adjustment for it, and by actually talking to that individual to understand what the challenges that they face. Just a side note. So here are the common challenges that we hear from clients, and a lot of them that's been mentioned by you, of course, and we'll go through them one by one with hopefully some strategies to mitigate some of these challenges. So the first challenge we look at is that lack of clear definition or differentiation between performance, potential, and readiness. So when we talk about performance, we're talking about what can this individual do right now. Potential is a bit more about what are they capable of doing in the future. And readiness is about, are they ready for a specific role? Now, managers do tend to get confused with performance and potential. I think one of the commenters say that, they mistaken that high performance is high potential. And this is where you can end up identifying the wrong person as hypo. The second challenge people tend to see, as we see a lot in chat as well, is how do we ensure that objectivity in high potential's identification process? Now, often the manager will select the high potential, and only those gets assessed it. But what about the ones who doesn't quite fit in that manager's mode of being a hypo, but are hypos? How do we identify them? Now, there are different ways to mitigate this. So you can give everyone the same assessment. So not just the ones that the managers select, but actually everyone in that target population, the same assessment to select hypos according to the criteria. But of course, this means a huge volume of people. You need to use scalable assessment to supplement the manager's rating that can help the organization quickly identify your hypos across that individual contribution population. An alternative way is to provide support or networking opportunities and or mentors to help elevate minorities and help them to be more at the forefront of their manager's mind. You can also monitor the diverse representation in nominations put forward firstly, but also those who end up being identified as hypos. Because what you really want to make sure is that the ratio should really represent the ratio of employees working at your organization. So if that ratio is not looking quite diverse, you want to investigate where the issue might be. Is it at the interview? Is it at the assessment? Is it the performance rating that's causing that imbalance? So really trying to use a database approach, the more success you'll be in ensuring that your process is as objective as possible. You can, of course, train your hiring managers, so help them understand what do we mean by hypos, help them understand, what does potential biases that could look like as well. So this could also go by helping that manager understand what they're assessing. It is important to have that diverse hyper bench because studies have found that organizations with more diverse talent on their hyper bench tend to perform better financially than those who doesn't have a diverse bench. So this is why we recommend to have as objective measurement of hypo as possible. The next challenge we tend to see or hear is, do you actually tell them? So different companies would hold different perspective on whether or not to tell the hypos that they are hypos. Some organizations would tell the hypos and keep out a box grid, which gets reviewed in every 2 years, or it's a list that evolves, that changes constantly. We tend to advise according to organization's context. So are their culture ready for that level of transparency, or constantly updating them, hey, you're a hypo, this is what we plan to develop you, this is what we're planning to do. So it really depends on a company's maturity when it comes to transparency. The next challenge we tend to hear is, do we understand what are the expectations are after being identified? So does your hypo or do your hypos know what's expected of them? But also, do you know what they expect from you? Do they expect, constantly being, challenged or developed? So how well do we know what the expectations are is one of the challenges we see. And lastly, not least, what about high performance, as we've got right pointed out in the chat as well? So what about those who are not hypos? And how do you communicate to them? But also, what development opportunities do they get? There is no single right answer for these challenges. Often, what you would do would depend on where your organization is at. Now, your course of action should be aimed at keeping both the hypos and the high performers engaged. And in the next two sections, that's exactly what we'll be talking about. Claire, anything to add before I hand it over to you?
No, just I was intrigued to maybe open up to the chat. Emily, you already beat me to it to say where you sit on the tell, not tell, and love the comment, by not telling them we're set up to fail. Just wondering if anybody wants to share in the chat, maybe anything that they are doing around that to encourage transparency or manage that process of telling, or indeed whether anybody is sitting still with a more covert process on what the reasons are around that. We're going to talk about retention strategies. So we talked earlier about some of the reasons and the criticality of identifying high potentials. Jenny, if you want to nudge on to the next slide for me, thank you. First thing that we know is, of course, there are some very real challenges out there for organisations. So ageing workforce, shortage in the demand of skills, increased competition and globalisation all really reference as exerting pressure on organisations. And because, of course, we've already made the point that high potential talent is significantly more productive and effective than non-high potential, retaining them, of course, becomes a really critical priority. If you've got them, then being able to retain them really must be something that organisations are focused around. And so to engage high potential talents, there are, of course, a number of things we can attempt to do. It does rely on the skill of often managers on the ground in so many respects to be able to be competent in doing so, or be fluent in the way that they manage these. So what do we recommend? What are some of the things that we look at in this space? So firstly, if you did join the first spotlight, you'll recognise that at LHH, we really do focus on human centricity in our approach to leadership, both in our assessments and also leadership development. And so we're going to really focus on that here in this context around high potentials. So the first thing is managers across a business really need to be able to develop and be equipped to engage with their employees at that much more human to human level. And so never more so than, of course, high potentials. And so to have those meaningful conversations and meaningful connections to help their teams, but of course, specifically in this context, high potentials to feel engaged. So we need managers who can help individuals to feel seen and to feel heard and respected for their uniqueness. And that requires the skill of authenticity, empathy, flexibility, and not all managers are necessarily equally equipped in that. If that as a particular topic is of interest or has piqued your attention, then we are running another webinar within LHH towards the end of January, 24th of January. We're looking specifically at how leaders can build connections through this human-centered lens. So we'd love to invite you to that. Little plug for a webinar outside of this Spotlight series. So look out for that, and we'll talk more about how to build effectiveness in leadership connections. But of course, when we're talking about this, we recognise that a whole person approach is needed. And in considering a whole person approach, there are three things that we look at, and it's at the bottom of the slide already. So the first thing is, in considering a whole person approach to the high potential talent, is challenge. I think that's already been something that you've identified in the chat. So high potential talent, having been identified, then need challenge to engage and stimulate that opportunity to learn and grow. Nice to see you, Kate, thank you. And ensuring that they're given challenging assignments, maybe multidisciplinary projects or rotations, but of course it does require the skill of not just business partners and the talent teams, but managers to be on the lookout for those opportunities to engage high potential talent in perhaps unique, agile, innovative ways across the business. And that requires a different mindset of managers to move from perhaps talent hoarders to talent sharers, and being able to encourage mobility of talent across the organisation. The second area then is around career pathing, and managers need to be able to have those regular conversations that discuss with the individual in all their contexts, both their career context, their life context, the organisational context that the individual finds themselves, around their aspirations. Again, we talked about it in Spotlight 1 around how our assessment approach can help that, but encouraging managers to lean in to those conversations. We know that often that's really difficult for managers to be able to do because they don't want to always surface perhaps aspirations they can't fulfill or desires for promotion that don't exist, but really equipping managers to have really meaningful conversations with individuals about what the future could look like for them, and ways to get there is really important. So supporting managers to consider lateral development, enrichment of roles, mentorship and career pathing plans, all part of that, equipping them to be able to do that effectively. And then the final area that we're going to just surface here is support. So providing additional and enough support for the high potential talent through either accelerated development programs, but we know, of course, that requires investment and can be costly, coaching, mentorship at the senior level, continuous feedback to enable them to feel that they are developing and growing, and opportunities to network, to really broaden their connections across the business so that they feel involved, engaged, connected, and able to be a part of their own story and narrative in their development, so that they can spot for themselves opportunities to move laterally or enrich their roles, and seek out support through their own network to encourage visibility as well. So lots in there, of course, lots of threads that I'm sure we want to pull on and talk about in more detail about what those look like. But I hope in just sharing this model on this page now that we've prompted you to think about where your own organisation might be, in particularly sort of the lens in which managers view high potential talent, and maybe you're considering particular aspects that you might need to focus in more on, or where maybe you may identify that actually we're doing enough in that, and that's something that you're already feeling really good about. So hopefully that is a useful frame for you to consider. Going to move to just touch on two final topics at really just a very high level. Where of the time, we are going to do a few Q&As at the end, but I know we've taken questions as we've gone through the webinar, so hopefully not too many questions sitting there unanswered from previous slides. In terms of challenges for the high potential individual, of course, we view that most people will be, delighted to have been identified, will be enthusiastic about taking on bigger assignments, greater challenge, bigger opportunities. But it is really important to step back from that assumption and really give consideration to the individual themselves and where they might be sitting at that moment of identification. So let's consider what they might be asking themselves. And it may well be, all of the things we've talked about, excitement, enthusiasm, but of course it may well be, is it right for me? Is it what I want right now? If I choose not to approach this opportunity for maybe joining an accelerated program or mentorship scheme, is that going to impede me in some way? Am I going to be penalised by not joining this? And so really enabling a climate where the organisation sets the tone for individuals to be really open about where they are and their aspirations. If we go back to research, we know that there's a really high proportion of CEOs who are in roles who actually don't want to be there and thought they should and ought to take it on. So climate is really key in your high potential talent system to impact whether people are transparent with you about their aspirations or not. And that transparency comes back to the maturity point that we made earlier around tell or not tell. It really requires some positive influences around the process to ensure that aspirations are shared open and honestly and with real authenticity, and that the commitment is there from a high potential development effort that goes into any follow-up. So hopefully that's just a useful kind of pause moment, I guess, when we think about the individual high potential. The final thing we wanted to just pay a nod to is considering high performers. So it would feel remiss of us not to attend to this in a topic such as high potential. So of course we just want to end with a reflection on this. So they just want to pay a nod towards high performers. So here we're talking about those employees that do a good job, deliver, perform well or well enough, and not forgetting the importance of those. So Harvard Business Review makes a really lovely point about that. We've got a quote from them on the screen. So companies' long-term performance, even survival, depends far more on the unsung commitment and contributions of their B players. And by B players, they're really referring to high performers. So the term B players may or may not have jarred with you, but of course it's really about, the point here is nurturing what you have. So we spent a lot of time talking about high potentials, but of course just paying attention to the criticality of those high performers that sit within your organisation also. Thank you. The link to the article there. Wonderful. Thanks, Sue. Brilliant. Okay, so let's wrap up with some sort of summary points from Jenny around what we've
Thank you, Colette. So essentially what we're saying is throughout this whole webinar, hopefully you would have got the sense that not all high performers are high potentials. What you really need is a clear, objective and data-driven way to really identify them, to ensure you identify the right person. And once you've identified them, you really want to engage and develop them to ensure that they stay with you. And lastly, talent strategies should not overlook your high performers because they are critical for your company's performance. And that said, we're going to go straight into Q&A because I can see a few questions. I'll pick out one which asked, mentorship. So do you suggest individual mentor by someone within the function or outside function, or internal or external? So typically organizations start with internal mentors first due to cost, but also they know the organization better. However, within the function and outside function, depending on how many people you have within each function, but also what are the relationships like? So is it quite hierarchical, which will make it harder for you to speak to someone within the same function? So there's just a few things you need to consider there. Go on.
Yeah, sorry, Jenny. There was another question, or I guess it was a point that I thought was well made, which was from Karen, just around really having certain things in place to embark on a potential approach. And Karen, you called out the manager's role, and you're absolutely right. There is a need to give consideration to the ecosystem of your approach and not just surfacing high potentials and then expecting managers to be able to engage them meaningfully without having had some development themselves. So it may be a phased approach in the maturity at which you embark on your high potential approach and evolve that as you get closer to sort of effectiveness around it. But certainly if managers are involved in things like nominations, giving them really clear toolkits by which they can understand the difference between high potential and high performance and what that looks like is of course going to be really critical. If managers are expected to have follow-up conversations around development with individuals, then making sure that managers are able to do that with some degree of effectiveness and rigor to engage and make those conversations land for the high potential talent, of course, again. So yes, there are some sort of system approaches needed to equip everybody to be successful.
I think the manager will also help feel quite a lot more confident once they have that knowledge in doing something as well. I think this brings up a really lovely point that Katie asked, which is, do you recommend companies initially investing in training managers to be able to identify, communicate and engage? So I would always say invest in managers in terms of having that, being able to have that conversation to identify, because they typically, for most organizations, they hold the key to identifying high posts. But of course, being an occupational psychologist, I also want you to add some of the more objective way, just because whilst we might be aware of our own biases, to mitigate them can be quite hard, because it could be subconscious, and therefore trying to stop something subconscious could be hard. Therefore, I would always say, yes, train them, but I also combine it with something else to try and make it more objective. Anything else you picked up, Colette?
No, I don't think so. I can't see any more questions. Sue has added a second link to that HBR article that references the B players, and that she calls out also includes remote workers and introverts, which was a point that was made around the inclusivity, which was really well made earlier. So thank you for calling that out. That's
great. As I said at the start of the session, you do have this list of lovely questions for you to think about. Hopefully, they will help you understand what to consider and what to ask yourself. This will be in the takeaway. So Rebecca, do you mind sharing a copy of all the key slides in the chat so people can download it? And whilst she's doing that, let me just say, next spotlight is on the 6th of February. So if you have time, please do attend. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Thanks everybody for joining.